So I just want to share just a little caution before we get into this next interview. It contains some graphic details regarding the death of a young girl, the family of a grade 10 learner in Alexandra Township who died in an apparent suicide, are pleading for help to bury her. It's alleged that Musa Tshabalala died last month and her grandmother cannot afford to bury her. It is also alleged that the teenager might have committed suicide after finding out that she was conceived when her 12-year-old mother was raped. Clinical psychologist Dr Tumi Mashego joins us now to talk about the tragedy and to share some insight on what to do when receiving emotionally damaging news, especially where young people are concerned. I also want to preface our discussion by saying that we don't know for sure all the details of the story, and we are making some assumptions based on what a cousin has said on the state of mind of the deceased. But we can still discuss what was shared and in more general terms discuss the impact that such events can have on people and how they can be guided and supported to prevent such things evolving into tragedy. Dr. Mashego, good morning. Thank you very much for your time and welcome to the program. So the details of the story, if all true, are just gut-wrenching. You have a young person here raised by their grandmother, then they find out they were conceived through an act of force and violence, rendering everything that they've known about their life a lie or a distortion. How damaging can that be for a young person in a situation like this?
Good morning, and good morning to your listeners. This is such, such a devastating consequence. It's very sad what has happened to the 16-year-old. And, as human beings, as adults even, we struggle with emotions, we struggle with processing, we don't have the capacity sometimes or the language. So what more so for a 16-year-old? The 16-year-old probably struggled with a lot of intense emotions, such as unresolved abandonment issues. If the mom is not present, there could have been a lot of rejection. And, coupled with the fact that, there was a lot of anger, pain, hurt, disappointment, and intense feelings of trauma secondary to, how he or she was conceived. And it's quite sad that the child was not properly assisted to process and navigate, the pain, just how she was conceived, and also just, leading to what is now her death, and also just the complicated grief process of, the relationship with the mother, but also the poor living conditions, and also probably, if the family member is to blame for the rape, they would likely not arrested. So it was a lot of really for a 16-year-old to handle.
And I'm going to deal with some of the issues that you mentioned there towards the end in terms of, when the perpetrator is alleged to be a family member, how families become, shrouded by silence. And that, again, just creates another layer of trauma for those who have been victimized. But I want to go to this as a starter, perceiving that you were abandoned by your mom, who is a child themselves, into the care of a grandmother. I mean, it's being framed as being abandoned, but would a victim of a crime, a child herself, have had any agency at all?
You see, that's the sad part about this story, that the mother herself was probably not assisted to process and navigate, the results of the rape. And probably wherever the mother could be, she's also traumatized and not coping years later, in spite of the years that have passed, which is, a double-edged sword in that, she was a child herself, and this led to, another generation of a child who's not okay. And the grandmother also probably did not have the capacity to, handle the situation, and unfortunately it has led to the consequences we see today, whereby there's a child who has subsequently taken her life, and it is really just a tragedy.
Well, the cousin, according to the report, says that her cousin had spoken to the media saying that Musa herself felt responsible for her mother not ever coming back home, and at the same time was dealing with this reality of extreme poverty. We talked about how the child was left in the care of her grandmother, herself quite poor. All of these factors creating an environment where there was so much potential emotional stunting, secrecy, a lack of resources, really, really difficult context in which to live herself and have to process all of this.
Definitely. I mean, with children, they never actually, stop hating their parents. They start, blaming themselves and internalizing that just because they have limited emotional capacity, logical reasoning, and, abstract ability just because of their development era. So now you can imagine with this adolescent who was now told such a lot of news, probably did not have the ability to comprehend. And what ends up doing is that what ends up happening is usually the child starts hating themselves or blaming themselves or internalizing, a lot of shame, guilt for the parent being absent because of the consequences. And just because, she was still a child who was developing, that's just where the reasoning capacity was for the child. But also, additionally having to, process the fact that this is how she was conceived. And you also wonder how she was told this is how she was conceived. Was it sort of somebody just said it in passing? Did they sit her down? Did they support her emotionally? Did they get her to see a professional to process that? Because that's a lot to process. Because, at that age also there's an issue of identity. You wonder if the child also was not struggling with an identity crisis, because, and a sense of belonging. So it could have really been a hopeless situation for the young person who has passed on.
And it traces back, apparently, to the allegation that the perpetrator was a member of the family. This thing of family secrets and covering up for a rapist or a molester, how rife is it? And how damaging is it for the survivors?
Yeah, especially in, your rural or African families, you find that, they cover up incest. There's a lot of taboo around that, and they let the perpetrator be and still existing. Usually it's because of financial gain, but also more so it's more just because of the lack of understanding of the impact on the person who is the victim, but also just the perpetrator, the shame to the family name. So they'll rather just protect, quote, the perpetrator, and the victim will suffer the consequences. And now this cascaded down from the mother into the child, and this is the consequence of that, which is quite sad.
What can, as a closer, to me, what can families do? And right at the very beginning, you talked about the grandmother having to take on this responsibility in a context of limited resources, of being alone herself. How do families get support in a situation like this?
I'm of view that if someone reports a rape in the family really needs to get the help for that person so that they begin to process. But also, if there is also offspring from the rape, obviously the offspring will be impacted, and to also not downplay, how a child will react, because sometimes we just ignore and expect the child to, process the big news. So we need to really support children to ensure that they're able to process and navigate trauma, because it can lead to complicated trauma whereby they're actually unable to function as adults, because childhood traumas can really impact one into their adulthood, that we don't just snap out of certain things. So I think it's very important to really seek help, and the social workers just reach out and make sure that the perpetrators are held accountable for what it is that they have done. But of course, if it's a family member, it becomes quite complicated. But still, I think we need to really put the message across that the victim should always be prioritized, so that we don't have situations like this whereby one takes their lives secondary to the rape.
I'm sure many families listening to this, Tumi, see themselves and their stories reflected in this particular story and in the interview we've just had, and let's hope that they do have the support that they need and also the courage to be able to do something about it. Thank you for talking to us this morning. Really appreciate your time, Dr. Tumi Mashego.